as much as it seems silly to be talking about food so much, it is one of the things you can do. The manual explains how to take it's not really a fish scale, it's really a luggage scale, and try hefting your hive that way. I've always just looked down into the hive and then tilted. I tilt my hive bodies to see underneath, hefted, counted the frames, and done it that way. Full or not full. But there are like this list here. I could put this list on if it would help anybody. I think the weights on this list below sort of look like bees and brood, because honey can get heavier than that. So I don't know if that's supposed to be mixed, sort of. But I pulled this out of one place because I thought it at least gives you an idea. If you're using deeps or mediums, 8 frames or 10 frames, keep track. Liquid is the better. Honey from the healthy hive or your bank, and you can bank honey in your freezer because it doesn't granulate as long as you freeze it. It likes to granulate at about, most honey's at about 55 and such. So you got to keep them warm, like at room temperature up in your kitchen upper shelf. Or if you put them out in your nice cool pantry and you think the honey would last longer, usually granulates on you, right? And then you feed 2 to 1 after you've given them whatever honey you are going to give them, or let them keep. And if you're unsure, I say just feed it. Sugar is so cheap. It's kind of bad for our figures, isn't it? I mean, for our nutrition. Sugar is so cheap in this country. It's ridiculous. And you feed until the daytime temps are below 55 degrees. Syrup isn't going to flow at below 50 degrees. If you've got it covered, and I'll show later how you have the insulation on top of your liquid feeder, you can probably go to 50 degrees. Just wait until they stop taking it. If you're using jar feeders, that's really easy. You can just see that they've stopped taking it. If you don't, then you got to watch the temperature more. And a lot of times it gets so cool at night and just barely in the low 50s during the day, and then it's back down to low 40s at night. Actually, the syrup is having trouble keeping warm and flowing. Dry. You can serve, it's considered dry, whether it's granulated, sprinkled, you know, totally like you serve it out of your sugar shaker, a fondant, an icing type, or a brick, a sugar block. And I go ahead and feed pollen subpatties quite often. Some people say back off on those if they have a lot of brood, so they won't keep building brood, but I don't know. I can't control my Californians. Some of them know how to limit their families and some don't, and I just, okay, sometimes you just do your best. That is one of the reasons people talk about differences with Carniolans and Caucasians. Be more careful about their stores in that they will sometimes cut back their brood correctly. They'll come down on that curve, that population curve, that you're hoping that they will naturally control themselves. And then, but then the same ones that brood down for the winter, sometimes in the spring, need a little extra boost to get going because they're slow to start up. And you need them up and running by the blackberry flow. I mean, honey's not the only reason we keep bees, but we sure could use the help financially, and our bees could use the stores. So if you've been in the beginner class, you've already heard this, when do you feed? There's all these reasons. We just went through summer dearth. It's time probably to switch to the 2 to 1. You sometimes feed 1 to 1 in summer dearth because, or partly because they need the water if it gets really hot, especially on the other side of the mountains. And the liquid there, see 50 degrees if it's fully covered, and the liquid is actually staying at 50 degrees. But you got to switch over to the solid if it goes any lower or they stop taking it. When you feed, it is best not to feed, stop, and start. And there's actually a research paper on that. I keep looking for something that backs up something that everyone says or that I just know is true. And you probably feel the same way. I can know something's true, but I can't always find a backup. Okay, and we're past the blackberry flow. Some of these slides I obviously stole, and I just finished putting them together right before we started. To feed or not to feed, I use the Wall Street test. You risk as much as you can sleep at nights risking. If you feel like your hive is going to make it and you can sleep at nights, don't worry. but it's cheap insurance if you decide to just feed anyway. And so they make a little extra sugar syrup honey, and they have it in the spring, right there in the hive, already warmed up and insulating the hive. I like jar feeders. Those jar feeders, they are a hassle. A commercial beekeeper wouldn't use them. But for small scale, or when you have nukes, or when you're monitoring certain hives closely, the uptake or downtake, I guess you'd say, the level of the in the jar tells you what's going on. Tells you if they're taking it. If they're not taking it, better go inside and check, even though you weren't going to, because you were trying to let that queen mate or whatever. You were trying not to disturb them. Preventing nutritional stress really does prevent disease. You heard this from your mom. Eat your veggies, you know, but it's the same. It really is true. For bees, they get less stressed. And then the new hives, you're past that. We see what's going on. And sometimes feeding, if your hives are side by side and you're pretty much in dearth, reduce those entrances down. But if you have any doubts, you might end up feeding the colony neighbors, because it will help prevent the bees from just going around to the next hive and trying to rob. Go get a free meal. Takeout. Limiting feed is an important commercial strategy. But for backyard, smaller scale beekeepers, think twice before you limit on purpose. It just sometimes backfires. Carl Kreilshine, there is on the top line. Feed continuously, stop and start feeding stresses the bees, and he did this really neat experiment decades ago. This is something that's been known for a long time. And I often warn people, you start and stop feed. One of the things that bees do that doesn't make sense to us, because we think anthropomorphically, we think like people, and we think emotionally. Bees are very practical. They are little efficiency experts. If a bee decides that for the good of the hive, we need to cut back on feeding, we don't have the stores. They are very logical. They look at the entire hive population and they say, we can't raise those eggs. They follow the queen and they eat the eggs behind her. She doesn't necessarily cut back on laying, they cut back on raising. Okay, maybe that's not too serious, but we're in July dearth and they don't have enough coming in. Next, they start eating the youngest larvae that hatched. They're not going to feed them. They have to keep the foragers going or the hive would collapse. They have to keep the queen going. The adults are more important. And this continues on until in a really bad July dearth, you open up the hive and all you see is cat brood. And the next time you come in, you don't even see the cat brood. They won't let the queen's eggs grow up at all. So watch for that in July. And that is often when people say, do I have a queen? I see no eggs, no young larvae, no uncapped larvae, and the capped larvae that's there is emerging. It's that old. So she hasn't laid in almost 21 days. And it can simply be they're in dearth. Look at, do they have any pollen stores? Do they have the bee bread ring around the brood? And you should already have finished that. But it may mean that your stores are really low, including pollen, which is one of the reasons why I'd say go ahead and feed some pollen sub now. I don't know if they can really store it, but at least they won't have to dip into any real pollen they've got stored if they can use that. All the bees need pollen, not just the young larvae. You kind of get that impression, but actually everybody needs protein, vitamins, lipids. We all need it. And nutritional stress reduced is a disease prevention strategy. It is a BMP, a best management practice. I think they stole that from MBAs or something. It sounds so technical when we say that as beekeepers. Yes, I practice my BMPs. I'm sorry, I'm a little overtired. I'm kind of giddy here. Okay, when you feed, do use entrance reducers or robbing screens, and you're watching for the yellow jackets. The smell of that hive is already starting to pull them in, and I'd love to hear, especially at the end of this, are you seeing the yellow jackets? Last year, you took your lid off the hive and they just died for it. You couldn't smash them as fast as they were coming in when you were trying to check your hive. So far, so good this year. But last year there was something that happened and it was free-for-alls. Luckily, I didn't get anything robbed out because I reduced entrances. I didn't even check my hives for a couple of weeks there. And it doesn't stop right away because wasps and such like bumblebees, can fly at about 10 degrees lower temperature than honeybees. You'll see a few honeybees straggling out there, but bumblebees are better pollinators for a number of things because they will do those extra hours of pollination in the morning and in the evening. And yellow jackets, that gives them that many more chances to sneak in past the guards who might have kind of pulled back from the entrance because it's cold and nobody's going in or out. And so they're actually a higher risk. Ann Harmon did some wonderful talks on sugar presentation, HMF. I don't know if anybody wants me to really explain what HMF. Hydroxymethanolfuranose. It is a degradation product of fructose, basically. And it forms if certain cornstarch is where you really find it, and cornstarch that has been made, high fructose cornstarch that you hear about, it's so bad, oh, it's so bad for you. Well, it's really bad for bees if it's been made with the acid hydrolysis method. And there's another method called the enzymatic. When you buy cornstarch, it's not labeled. Corn syrup. When you buy corn syrup, it's not labeled which way it was made, and it's not labeled how it was stored. The acidity with heat and with time, any one or two or all three of those makes HMF, which is very toxic to bees. It would be toxic to people too, but we just aren't that dependent on sugar in our diet, no matter how much we seem to eat or like it. But with bees, it is very toxic. When you go to make candy blocks and stuff, I put this probably in the wrong place, but a tablespoon of water per pound of granulated white sugar. It's such an easy recipe. And that's from Rusty Burlew. I always recommend her honeybeesweet.com when you want to quick check something. She knows how to run a website, and you enter it in your search term in, and you'll often get right to what you want. Something like you want sugar recipes, feed recipes. A lot of you have already decided what kind of feeder to get. One of the reasons for doing the winterization talk now is in case you haven't decided or you're going to try a new one, this you may have to order, especially, I think Man Lake has finally got its act together. Somebody said that they finally got the catalog that they ordered like over a month ago. So hopefully they're catching up. They got the supply chains working again. But if not, don't wait too long. And inline, you remember these from if you took a beginning beekeeper, you remember that. It's always possible to use a Ziploc, and that's kind of that can change the height. It can be a very low profile, depending on what your system is of how you're going to put the feeders inside, which is the best. And if you're going to do it outside, this is wrong. This should have an entrance reducer right here, so it's not easy for robbers to sneak right in and around the corner. Make it hard. Leave an inch over here if you're really going to do a board bin. Or even better, put the board bin inside. Flat, low-profile feeder that works with top bars that have peaked roofs. I put it in because Frederick Dunn was the one that showed it on his. He's one of the people I recommend for a good YouTube video blog. Once a week, and he answers questions and such too. Oh, this I don't understand. Why WASPA put this in the beginner manual, I don't understand. You never put these directly on the frames. Because if you forget, especially in the springtime, they'll start building from up above. There's no ceiling here. There's no reason they wouldn't build comb from whatever lid you have up above. And that actually happened to someone. And it was, it was horrific. But they showed us this, but it isn't true. Don't do that. When you're picking your feeder, you're going to be thinking about how do I get to it to refill it without completely removing the inner cover and disturbing the bees. Because we don't just drop in temperature. We can hover there at that like 55 where you could be feeding them liquid feed during the daytime, still 55, for quite a while. So you want to have something that you can easily get to. Okay, I've drummed it. I think I've said enough. I am repeating myself somewhat. Solid is really only an emergency food. Sometimes I don't hear people recognize that. It doesn't insulate. The bees aren't right next to it. It's not right alongside of them when they're in cluster. They have to come up and get it. So things have to be warm enough and they have to be mobile enough that they can come up and get it and mix it with water. So probably there's some condensation on the side of their hives. You don't want no condensation. You just don't want condensation dripping on your cluster. So here's some methods where this you do often put directly on the frames and use either another hive body, which is really too deep. This looks like a Western. That's a lot of airspace in there. But some kind of shim or spacer, and I think here's an emery shim, sometimes called a honey shim. And that's not really the only thing you use this for. This is actually, see that little notch there? This narrow shim, people often put it on top of their honey supers to give the bees a second entrance to come in, and the foragers can go in, quick drop off of the whatever they're carrying, the honey to the receiver bees, or they take their pollen pellets and pack them into the pollen cells. If they can do that, coming in quickly through this top, instead of coming through the main entrance, all the way up through the brood chambers, working their way up, it makes more sense. It does seem like you would probably get a little bit better honey production. So this is called an emery or a honey shim, and this was actually how to do it, not the plans. But a shim is often, here's another one. Sometimes it's called a rim too. And sometimes I like to put 1/8 inch screen stapled on underneath to hold whatever I've got in there. We're going to talk about moisture absorbency in a minute, and styrofoam too, and stapled burlap too. I've got a picture of that coming up. But before we leave feeders, make sure that you are happy with the kind you picked. You're going to try a new one this year. I would order it before anything can go wrong with the supply chains. And sugar. Actually would not wait until the last minute to get sugar because it was so crazy in the spring. People were running out and they were saying, don't hoard. I'm going, I'm a beekeeper and it's pouring rain all the way into June. I need the sugar. No, not me. I'm not. It's my bees. Okay. It's like when you go in, well, you probably don't do that kind of treatment, but if you use alcohol and you're actually using ethanol and beekeeping and you're trying to explain, I need the full thing of vodka. Yeah, right. Little ladies, we know. They don't believe me. But that's okay. It's for my bees. It really is. Okay, accessible. So make sure that you're going to be able to monitor it in the weather that you're going to have without chilling the brood. I really recommend internal if you can possibly do it versus the external. But don't cover up your ventilation. You want that airflow going through. If you can get a 3/8 inch gap between the bars of the top bar and above the top bar if you can too. If not, at least something where you put it right on the top bars, right on the tops of the frame. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm reading that wrong. It's my own writing. Top bars, if you put the feeder on top, you got to give them a gap to get up and down. So you're going to have to move the bars of the top bar apart. Okay. I've been trying to put notes in about top bars because people are really fascinated with top bars and they are a little bit different. Early in the spring, can be January, you will suddenly have increased humidity and need for ventilation. Maybe you didn't really need a top vent and you didn't really check it and they propolised it over. You may need to check. And I have a picture coming up of when I noticed it. It was when when they start to brood up, and it's after the winter solstice. Shortest day of the year. Don't ask me how the bees know. It's always raining, but I guess it's like they can figure out where the sun is on a totally clouded over raining day. They can somehow sense that the days are getting longer once they pass the solstice, and they will start raising the queen's eggs. A lot of your feeders, there's a ladder, a mesh, you put some straw sticks in to prevent the bees from drowning. Make sure they can always climb out. Look at your feeders. Although bees have been known to fill your feeders with dead bees once the feeder's empty, and people say, oh, they drowned. Well, not necessarily. Sometimes they just have to push the dead bees out of the hive, and they aren't going out because it's too darn cold. So they will put dead bees up on your inner cover, and they will also push them into like an empty feeder if you had a frame feeder that you had to leave in there, which is a consideration. If it gets too cold, you may not want to open your hive up, pull your frame feeder out, and put frames in. You may just have to leave it in for the winter and then clean it out in the spring. And robbing risk, And your decisions may be different than commercial. Commercial's going to go for cost, including labor costs. So if you hear something that conflicts with everything I've already said, I just ask you to think about that. Pollen patties. Everyone I've ever seen make pollen patties makes them too thick and too dry. You want it ooey gooey goopy. And you make it with like 2-to-1, forget those recipes. I just mix the powder with 2-to-1 syrup. And because sugar is hygroscopic, that'll keep it goopy. You make it peanut butter consistency, and you've got all that sugar in there, it pulls moisture in. That's hygroscopic. Don't you love those big words?